Washington, D.C. will not go gently into the good dictatorship. Specifically, the D.C. grand jurors, who 6 times now have told Donald Trump's dirty DOJ officials, no, we will not indict your BS trumped up felony charges. And friends, I have to wonder if this development has anything to do with Donald Trump's United States Attorney for the District of Columbia, Jeanine Pirro, disrespecting, demeaning, and berating the grand jurors for not bending to her will, for not bending to Donald Trump's will. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, can I tell you something? I loved my time appearing before grand juries in Washington, D.C. For 24 of my 30 years as a federal prosecutor, I spent tons of time investigating and indicting cases before D.C. grand juries. And let me tell you, friends, grand jurors sacrifice much to perform what is an extraordinarily important public service, a civic duty. What do they sacrifice? Well, let's talk about their term of service. How long do grand jurors sit? This may be more than you want to know, but in D.C., because we're a federal city, we're not a state, we have this sort of unique jurisdiction there. We have 2 kinds of grand juries. We have a superior court grand jury, and they indict cases that are mainly local cases, though not exclusively. And then we have a federal court grand jury, actually several federal court grand juries, and they, as the name would suggest, indict primarily federal cases. However, in this interesting jurisdiction we have in D.C., superior court grand juries can return federal indictments, and federal court grand juries can return superior court, local indictments. Here's how long grand jurors serve. In the superior court grand juries, they serve 5 days a week for 6 weeks. In the federal court grand juries, they serve for 18 months, and they average 8 work days a month for 18 months. So let me ask you, friends, would you look forward to sacrificing 6 weeks, 5 days a week, or 18 months, 8 days a month to perform this important civic duty? Would you want to take, 6 weeks or 8 days a month for 18 months away from your work, away from your family, especially if you're a stay-at-home mom or dad, have to arrange for childcare? Yes, grand jurors sacrifice much, but what they do it's a sacred duty. It's a valuable duty. It's an honorable duty. It's a necessary duty, and we ask a lot of them. First of all, they take an oath to decide each and every case, every indictment question, in accordance with the facts and the law and nothing else, without fear, without favor. And that's what grand jurors do every day in jurisdictions around the country, and that's certainly true in Washington, D.C., from my experience inside grand juries for decades. They take their oath of service and their civic responsibility deadly seriously. And perhaps more importantly, grand juries act as a check, as a guardrail, as a safeguard against what? Prosecutorial overreach, abuse, and misconduct, which is exactly what it seems like Donald Trump's U.S. Attorney in D.C., Jeanine Pirro, has been engaged in: grand jury overreach and abuse. Why do I say that? Well, I say it first and foremost because now 6 times grand juries have received evidence and evaluated that evidence as presented by Jeanine Pirro, in substance, sending her prosecutors into the grand jury seeking felony indictments. And six times, the grand jury said, no, the evidence isn't there. You don't have it. We take our oath seriously, and we're not going to indict people for felony crimes. In some instances, felonies that carry up to 8 years in prison just because you, Jeanine Pirro, tell us to. We're not going to do your dirty bidding or Donald Trump's dirty bidding. So what might be prompting this? Well, first and foremost, it's obviously the grand jurors taking their oath deadly seriously and refusing to return charges that are not supported by the facts or the law. But I also have to wonder, friends, if any of this is a product of what Jeanine Pirro has been saying about D.C. grand jurors. That is the community that she is sworn to protect and serve. Let's start with what Jeanine Pirro is saying about the grand jurors who refuse to bend to her will, and then we're going to look at some of the new reporting about what the grand jurors have been doing in specific cases. But first, listen to this, friends. This is some reporting from the Daily Beast about a segment that Jeanine Pirro did, on her former network, Fox. And the headline is, Fox News grills Judge Jeanine on sandwich indictment fail. I take exception with calling her Judge Jeanine. She now, unfortunately, is US Attorney for the District of Columbia Jeanine. The article begins, Fox News host Shannon Bream isn't letting Trump's hand-picked prosecutor Jeanine Pirro skate past her role in President Trump's crime crackdown. Bream, on Fox News Sunday, challenged the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia over her failure to get a grand jury to indict a man accused of throwing a sandwich at a Customs and Border Patrol agent. Quote, you talk about getting to court, getting your prosecutors together, and getting these cases together, but here's the headline from the Washington Post a couple of days ago. D.C. judges and grand jurors push back on Trump policing surge, Bream said. Quote, there's at least one high-profile case where they're making a lot of headline news about the fact that you couldn't get a grand jury to indict, Bream said of the hoagie hurler who was arrested as part of Trump's crackdown on crime in Washington, D.C. So the Fox host poses the question, so how does that factor into what you're trying to do? And then, friends, comes this from Jeanine Pirro about the citizens of the District of Columbia who are selected to serve and who are fulfilling their civic duty by serving as grand jurors without fear or favor. Pirro says this. Pirro, who is a former Fox News host, shot back, blaming jurors for failing to grasp the reality of the crime that is occurring because they live in Georgetown or other affluent neighborhoods. This quote from Jeanine, quote, my office has been instructed to move for the highest crime possible, consistent with the law, the statute, and the evidence. And in that one case, we were on point, but the grand jurors don't take it so seriously. They're like, whatever, she said. Pirro claimed the D.C. residents are so used to crime, that crime is so normalized in D.C. that they don't even care about whether or not the law is violated. She said, this was the very essence of my problems in D.C., and that her plan is to turn this ship around as President Trump has directed. Friends, in all my years as a prosecutor, I have never once heard a United States attorney publicly berate, demean, or disrespect grand jurors. the way Jeanine Pirro did. You know, it disgusts me, it infuriates me, and I can only wonder how the people of Washington, D.C., including those who are serving or have served as grand jurors or as trial jurors, I wonder how they feel about the obscenely disrespectful public condemnation by Donald Trump's flunky, Jeanine Pirro. Well, we may not know how they feel about it, but we do know what the grand juries are doing. Here is some of the new reporting from NBC News. Headline: D.C. grand jury declines to indict another defendant amid Trump's crime crackdown. Grand juries have declined to indict at least 6 times in recent weeks during President Donald Trump's federal policing effort in Washington. And that article begins: a federal grand jury in Washington declined to indict a woman accused of threatening President Donald Trump on social media, another sign of pushback from D.C. residents over the use of federal law enforcement and deployment of National Guard troops in the city. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia accused Nathalie Rose Jones of Indiana of threatening to take the life of the president and transmitting threats over state lines on Instagram and Facebook. Jones allegedly called Trump a terrorist and a Nazi in a voluntary interview with the Secret Service. She attended a march in Washington on August 16 that went around the White House complex and was then arrested, though she said she had no desire at the time to harm Trump. Friends wrote letters to the court that Jones has had mental health issues. In a motion filed Monday, Jones' attorney disclosed that a grand jury didn't indict her. Quote, a grand jury has now found no probable cause to indict Ms. Jones on the charged offenses, her federal public defenders wrote, seeking to get Jones released on her own recognizance. Quote, given that finding, the weight of the evidence is weak, her lawyers wrote of the grand jury's decision. The government may intend to try again to obtain an indictment, but the evidence has not changed and no indictment is likely. For this reason, the court should release Ms. Jones on her personal recognizance to appear if required. It is rare for a federal grand jury to decline to indict, but it's becoming an emerging trend in Washington amid Trump's federal crackdown, with grand juries made up of local residents declining to indict at least 6 times in recent weeks. Last week, a grand jury declined to indict a former Justice Department employee, Sean Dunn, who was seen on video tossing a hoagie at the chest of one of the federal law enforcement officers patrolling the streets of Washington. Dunn has become a symbol of opposition to the federal takeover among D.C. residents, with Banksy-style art depicting a man tossing a sandwich appearing around the city. A grand jury also declined to indict Alvin Summers with assault on a federal officer, and 3 federal grand juries refused to indict Sidney Laurie Reed with assault during a scuffle with an FBI agent, and her charges were downgraded to a misdemeanor. And friends, in that last case in the reporting, United States of America versus Alvin Summers, here's an interesting twist. After the grand jury refused to indict Mr. Summers for a felony assault on a police officer, Jeanine Pirro's office moved to dismiss the case, apparently recognizing they didn't have the goods, they didn't have the evidence to indict Mr. Summers on a felony charge. They moved to dismiss the case without prejudice. What does that mean? Well, if the judge grants the motion to dismiss without prejudice, it means Jeanine Pirro could have her prosecutors try to do it all over again anytime, she felt like it, present it to another grand jury, see if they could, cram it down the throat of that grand jury, a felony indictment of Mr. Summers. But the defense attorney filed a motion saying, no, in the interests of justice, the prosecutors, Jeanine Pirro, should never be permitted to try this again, and we are asking the court to dismiss it with prejudice. Here's just a little bit of the defense motion in the Summers case. Given the grand jury's decision, Mr. Summers should not be forced to live under the threat of later charges and rearrest. The charges against Mr. Summers were based on an allegation made by one officer who was wearing a body-worn camera. That officer's testimony was rejected by the grand jury, presumably after reviewing the body-worn camera video, allowing the government, that would be Jeanine Pirro and her prosecutors, allowing the government the possibility of rebringing charges under these circumstances is prejudicial and unwarranted. Wherefore, the court should dismiss the complaint with prejudice. And friends, I just checked the court docket in the Alvin Summers case. The judge just ordered Jeanine Pirro, her prosecutors, to file a reply to the motion filed by Alvin Summers' defense attorneys, seeking to have the charges dismissed with prejudice, such that Jeanine Pirro could never attempt in the future to gin up those charges again. So remember when we talked about the grand juries a few minutes ago that sit in Washington, D.C., the ones in Superior Court and the ones in federal court? In Superior Court, there are like 4 or 5 grand juries up and running simultaneously at all times. I think there are at least 2 or 3 in federal court. They sit for a term of 18 months, 8 days a month, up and running simultaneously. That's a lot of grand juries. Thank goodness that it looks like 6 of the grand juries have already performed that all-important civic responsibility of being a check, a guardrail, a safeguard against Jeanine Pirro's overreach and abuse. Thank goodness for grand juries, because justice matters. Friends, as always, please stay safe, please stay tuned, and I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.